All right, welcome to another episode of Critical Weight Theory, where I talk about different things like movies, TV shows, sometimes politics, and sometimes music. And I have to admit, I'm not that familiar with the band, the Divinyls. And if you think of the Divinyls purely through the lens of "I Touch Myself," their most well-known song, then you'll have an idea of what this album might provide, even if the lyrics don't unsettle prudes as much as their hit that's about handling the bearded clam. So today I'm talking about their album Underworld, which is the Divinyls' fifth and final studio album, released on August 10th, 1996. It's a record that's really at the edge of their catalog, from what I understand. It's supposedly darker, heavier, and more inward looking. And in many ways, it sounds like a band staring directly at their own ending. By the mid 1990s, again, from what I understand, the Divinyls were no longer riding the commercial wave they had enjoyed earlier in the decade. Their 1991 self titled album had produced that global hit, but the industry was shifting fast. Alternative rock was more of a thing, and it was in many ways harder. The grunge thing and alternative metal, and of course regular metal, and a lot of things were changing. Pop was fragmenting. Of course, rap was there. Bands that thrived in the 1980s and early 90s were struggling to find their footing in all of this, and I don't think things are too different for the Divinyls. Underworld emerges from that moment of instability. Musically, it's like soft rock, but filtered through occasional harder alternative rock textures with a moody palette. This isn't the glossiest, most radio friendly record. It's a bit more tense because of its raw feel. It's kind of bruised sounding, it's often uncomfortable in a way, and that's probably intentional. A lot of that weight comes from singer Chrissy Amphlett herself. At this point, Amphlett was dealing with significant personal struggles, and the album reflects that emotional turbulence. According to later accounts, even the band's management seemed unsure of how to handle her energy, reportedly giving contradictory stage directions like "be loose as a goose, but aggro," whatever that weird phrasing means. Like how do you be loose as a goose but aggro? Like what? I read that while I was doing some research on this on this band. And the push and pull between vulnerability and aggression is written all over Underworld. It's like an album that doesn't quite know what it's trying to say, and I guess maybe that's part of what it is saying, you know. So it's not really a bad album in my opinion, but it's just not one that you're going to instantly vibe with. Probably you might need to listen to it more than once, and I'm sure that a lot of people out there didn't listen to it that often. The album was produced by Charlie Drayton, the band's drummer at the time, and Amphlett's husband, which gives the record a strangely intimate feel. It doesn't sound smoothed over or sanitized. If anything, it sounds exposed, like it wasn't trying to chase trends or rescue chart positions. And I respect that. That's not to say there are no catchy songs on the album. I don't mean to paint such a dramatic picture and make it sound like it's avant-garde sounds all over the place or something like that. These aren't field recordings of frogs that have some woman singing singing over them or something weird like that. It is a normal enough album, but it's just a little bit different. Track by track, Underworld moves between ballads and, in some ways, heavier material, allowing Amphlett's voice to do what it always did best, to show some rawness and fragility. So songs like for a good time and I'm jealous have some sharp emotional tension, while tracks like Black Magic and Hard on Me bring a tougher, more abrasive edge without being particularly heavy. I don't want to make you think that this is like a headbangers album or something like that. I don't think you're typically going to find people, you know, uh likening this to heavy metal or something. One of the album's most successful moments is Human on the Inside. It's a standout track, restrained, wounded, and deeply empathetic, and its power is proven by the fact that it was later covered by the Pretenders. So that alone speaks to the songwriting strengths buried inside this album. Another highlight is Heart of Steel, which captures a reflective core of Underworld. It's not defiant in a triumphant sense, it's defiant in the way that someone keeps going even when they're exhausted. And that might sound like an insult, but I don't mean it that way. When Underworld was released, the response was mixed. Some critics praised its maturity and raw emotional honesty. Others thought it lacked the immediacy and commercial pull of the Divinyls' earlier hits, especially their big hit. And the album wasn't heavily promoted, and it didn't make much of a dent commercially, at least from what I understand. And by the way, if I'm incorrect about anything here, go ahead and let me know. I know in practically every video I do, there's going to be somebody who will argue with something I've said. But, feel free to let me know about anything like that. The lack of success doesn't tell the full story of this album. In hindsight, Underworld feels less like a failed comeback and more like an unfiltered closing statement. It's the sound of a band no longer chasing approval and a singer refusing to soften herself for the sake of comfort. It also marked the end of the Divinyls studio output, of course. There would be no next chapter, no stylistic reinvention, no late career revival album. This was it. And yet its legacy has grown quietly over time. And that's why I'm suggesting you might want to check this song, or not song, but album out, because it does have songs that might grow on you over time if you repeatedly listen to this. And I don't know how often I will take my own advice on that, but it's a solid album. And for fans, Underworld is now seen as an artistically daring and deeply personal record, one that captures singer Chrissy Amphlett at her most unguarded. Her influence as a performer is fearless, confrontational, and emotionally exposed, and it continues long after the album's release. And unfortunately, of course, Chrissy is no longer with us, but her music is, so that's always something you can say about somebody who had a musical career. And Underworld may not be the Divinals' most famous record, and it probably never will be a close contender for like the greatest album of its time. But it sounds like an honest album, and sometimes that's the type of album that really matters most.